Hi, welcome back and welcome to our final full session of the afternoon on the third day, Wednesday. It's great to have you with us. And we have Melissa Murphy-Thompson from Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. You may remember Melissa from yesterday when she co-presented with her colleagues at Columbia. And today she's embarking on her solo career, and she's going to talk about resilient learning communities, interventions and teaching strategies in the time of COVID-19. So really looking forward to Melissa's talk, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, David. Let me just share my screen with you all. And thanks for taking the time to come today. You have so many amazing choices. I'm honored that you're here. So I wanted to share a bit about some of the questions that we'll be working through today. And this all came after COVID. Probably we initially started, at least the work that I'm presenting to you started probably within the first 4 weeks of the COVID experience and how teaching was going. I teach at Dominican University in River Forest. I'm their online learning coordinator. I generally teach most classes online, so I've had that advantage, but COVID really changed the way I work with students and the way I teach and how I infuse different pedagogy into my classes. So today, some of the questions I thought we could think about as we go forward are, what are the benefits to being a trauma-informed professor and professional? And I'll share some thoughts with you about that. What specific models of pedagogy meet the needs of this moment? And at the time I thought of this presentation, it was in the middle of COVID, but we should also be thinking about this from the perspective of how do we start moving out of COVID, and so what kind of pedagogy will meet the needs of this moment as well. And then how do we build resilient learning communities during a global pandemic and beyond? So there's limited attention and research to the political traumatic experiences and global traumatic experiences and their impact on students and professors. And so some of the limited research I found was there's a personal sense of insecurity, and often there's political division and disbelief. And we certainly saw that in the United States related to the global pandemic. I'm not sure if you saw that in other countries if you're from outside the US, so I'd be certainly interested in hearing that. And then the limited research also is very limited on the collective impact of students and instructors. So I want to set the stage. In the learning communities I was in at the time, I was already online. I had colleagues that were moving online. Whether it was a student or a colleague, we saw many crises experiences happening. And then I really use the model of community in the courses that I teach. So that stage was already set. Students knew that we were a community. And I think that helped us take a bit of a leap when we first came together. So as I had 2 weeks to prepare, and as I said, I was online already, but the idea to prepare, even though I was already online, is where was I? What did I need to have in place for myself to create this holding space or this effective learning community for my students? And what could and couldn't get done any longer when we were thinking about syllabi and assignments and group work. And I came up with this mantra, and I had post-its everywhere that said flexible and nimble. And that served me well as having a mantra of this new reality that we were going into collectively. So the first thing that happened, we had spring break at the university, and then we extended the spring break an additional week. So students and faculty had 2 weeks off. And the first thing I found out was I was the most naive professor, or certainly on, team naive for sure. And by that, I mean, I thought my learning communities would be less affected because they were already online. They weren't learning how to learn online. But what I found out when we did a community check-in, which I do each time I meet with students synchronously, was no one at our university had talked with students about their losses and fears and the experience. And I don't say this to disparage anyone at my university, right? We were all going through new experiences in our own crises. But I will point out that I teach this particular class I'm talking about at the end of the week. It's Thursday evening course, and no one had asked the students. And what I found was that we spent the time processing this crisis that the students were experiencing, their losses and their fears, and that ended up being in the entire class. And here comes that mantra sneaking in again, right? That I need to be flexible and nimble to meet the needs of the learning community. So how do we make a learning community resilient? How do we work with all members? And I am a social worker, so the words assessment and intervention come to mind, but you certainly can look at these in a variety of ways if you're coming from a corporate experience. So the first thing when we talk about crisis intervention that many of you may have already experienced working with your students is I had to normalize the experience students were saying when they didn't know when this was going to end. I had to really validate the idea that nope, we're not going to be able to work the way we worked before the pandemic. And then we had to regularly provide some space to support student vulnerability and to validate that their experience was their own, even though we were a learning community. Individual experiences were really important, and I had to make myself very available to students to support that experience. And I'll give you one example. I had a student that's in an internship, going to school full-time, working at Target, supposed to work 15 hours a week at Target, now is scheduled for 60 hours at Target. And how am I going to get my work done since so many people are not coming to work? So I have to meet the student where they're at. The other thing we face was students are having no sense of normal. They're in this ambiguous space. They don't know when. I think some of us were kind of naive, thinking this pandemic might be like a 2-week snow day. At least in Chicago, we have snow days, right? So I think we were a little naive about that. And where do we create space so students have a place for fear and grief, but they still have a place to learn? So I had to use some information related to the concepts of psychological first aid. I had to listen and create space for students to listen and allow them to connect with myself and with other. I had to protect information for them through using routine things that they were used to from me. And I had to do some things over and over again, because when you're in crisis, materials and information don't necessarily stick. And so how could I support students in keeping information focused and centered, if they could, if they were in this space to do that, as we were teaching and going through it? And I had to model that myself. So again, the concept of resilient learning communities and the pandemic and beyond also means that we are meeting the learning community where they are at, whether it's individuals or the collective community. Some students caught COVID, and so I had to meet them at that biological space of how do we move forward? How severe is their illness? Do they want to move forward? And so on. And then I mentioned how we were working through psychological and emotional upheaval. So I had to use knowledge and skills that allowed me to meet the collective needs of the individual learning community, but pivot when an individual was needing help. And then sharing some questions or comments with students about an individual's needs to check in with the community itself to see if they actually needed that support. Certainly not, breaking privacy, but if one student was having an issue, let's say with a job, another student might be having that issue. If one student was having an issue with access to food, another student could be having that issue. So how did I do this? So I looked at the learning community as a client, and I was teaching 4 classes at this time. So I looked at the strengths of the students that I'd already seen. We were halfway through a semester and beyond. I certainly looked at the gaps and opportunity for growth. I wanted to give students the opportunity to be self-determined. So what could they do that they felt they were really good at in order to meet the goals of the assignments that we call signature assignments in our syllabi? So when we're talking about the new normal, this will continue, I think, for a while. This also was seen in the fall. I had to evaluate the resources that students had. I had to be very mindful that they had limited cognitive space. Many of my students were either facing health issues themselves, or a family member had a health issue. They were facing financial hardships. And because my program is online, often people that come are drawn to online learning are professionals or people who are changing careers. So lots of my students lost available time. So then we spent time also talking about what was their social support system like that could help them, and what was their support system like at the university so that they could get some assistance and flexibility depending on the needs that they had in this new ambiguous normal. And then I had to think about meaningful learning activities, really what the heck had to be done so that students could navigate this crisis with limited resources. So when I talk about meaningful learning activities, often we think of learning activities that everybody's doing the same activity, right? And I needed to discern whether or not students needed to do, everyone's doing the same activity, or I can navigate some of these activities to meet the competency or the outcome of the assignment. And that takes me into some concepts related to the models of pedagogy I use during this time and again during this school year. So I have been trained in trauma-informed teaching and learning. Shout out first of all to Columbia, who offered the first opportunity for me to participate in something like this. So I've been doing a lot of research on this and making my students aware that I teach from a trauma-informed perspective. Everyone brings trauma into the workplace, into the classroom, into the communities they participate in. Whether they share that trauma openly or not is personal preference. But so I needed students to be able to know that I was trustworthy and I was transparent. I needed to give them some support and connection, and I wanted them to have voice and choice. I really wanted to be able to collaborate with them on assignments. And I did things like say, this is how I envisioned this before the pandemic started, or this is how I envisioned this assignment, but I would love to hear about your talents and your ideas in order to meet this moment or this particular assignment. I had to be very mindful of cultural and historical contexts, students that might have had historical and cultural trauma, and what this experience was like, and how those trauma from the past perspective and the current perspective were being aggravated, is the word I'll use right now. And then where, as a community, were we resilient? So transparency, I don't know anything more about working in a pandemic than you do, but I will work with you every step of the way. We are a community and we will get through this together, and I'm scared too. And in the academy, especially, imposter syndrome is a big thing. So being this open and vulnerable with students, I had to keep looking at those mantra post-its that said be flexible and nimble. I had to be transparent that I didn't know any more than they did. We would do it together, and I was afraid of things too. And so in the essence of support and connection, I created a variety of different things for my learning community. So every Monday I had been giving students a Monday Minute. And on a Monday Minute, you get information on what's coming up in this week. If I've graded anything, I make a general comment about the assignment. I always make sure my students can go into the learning management system through my Monday Minute. I increased my drop-in hours from twice a week to 4 times a week. I never had an open slot. Students were there all the time, even if they just wanted to talk with someone because they were lonely and living alone. So it was really humbling to experience that with my students. I offered self-care passes where you could not come to class and you just turned in your self-care pass, no questions asked. And I gave students opportunities to connect with each other. So students that wanted to work in teams, I did allow them to work in teams, and those that had to work individually because of the situation they were in did assignments alone. And then we had an asynchronous coffee shop, so to speak, in our learning management system where students could leave messages for each other that I monitored to make sure that people were safe, but they could speak to each other asynchronously as well. So I want to give you some examples. I know this is a lot of font, but this is a sample of one of the check-in requests I made of them, right? This is what I wanted them to understand about the pandemic principles we were going to operate from. I wanted to remind them that they weren't alone. I wanted to let them know that I was taking on new roles, right? Some of them were teaching their children at home. Maybe they had to move out of a dorm, that I was there to help. And I shared email and a phone number with them now that I was off campus, so they knew as a learning community how we were operating. And then the next time we were together synchronously, the pandemic principles were presented and we reviewed those against our regular community learning agreements. So this is again another reiteration of this. I wanted to remind them, again, in a crisis, people don't often hear or see what you say the first time. I allowed them to be reminded of the support systems we had available in our university community, but I also wanted to know if someone was an essential worker. I really wanted to talk with them about how we could work together to navigate that course. I really had to be flexible with students that were on the front lines of serving during this pandemic. And then this came up, I had heard this from actually a dean of mine and who had served in the Army, and they were telling me that they were telling some others that they remembered in the Army, we talk about change as it doesn't matter if we were told to take the hill from one side and then told we had to take it from another side. We still have to take the hill regardless. And so it helped the students initially to know we're taking on the hill, which is the class, right, and the content. We just are going to have to do it differently. And one of the things that came of this for me as I went into the fall was reminding students, I show this quote, but we may have to do something differently. I may not know your situation, but I am here to be as flexible as I can to help you achieve your learning goals. So if you're looking at 3 to 4 classes and not sure what to do, start with me. I know I can be flexible and I love to collaborate with you. And I was fortunate this fall to have students in some of my learning communities that had me in the spring that could validate that I meant what I said. And this is a self-care assignment. I canceled class. I was getting the sense that people were really tired one week. People were super stressed, and so I canceled the evening class. I highlighted in here that I was taking care of myself, which is a really important thing in our profession. So the students know that I run. And so the new assignment due today, here are some suggestions of how to take care of yourself. And please share this with your colleagues in case you think they're not paying attention to announcements, because sometimes they don't. So trauma-informed teaching and learning also asks us to look at collaboration. So I took a look at collective assignments to make revisions, policy changes, and grading changes. So we had discussion questions that were suddenly extra credit. They weren't every week. Students created mini communities where they decided to support each other, and then they would come in, their mini community would come in during my office hours and check in with each other. And each class then began starting with mindful practices. Some students like mindfulness and some students really don't like mindfulness, is what I learned. But many students then used it to practice themselves. So the other thing that I did was camera on or camera off became this very big thing at the beginning of COVID, and we're going to be rigid, and the only way I know you're attending is if you have your camera on or off. I did not start that way, probably because of my social justice perspective. I started out with do not drive while you're looking at Zoom. That's it. That's my only requirement. I don't know what's happening in your home. If you're learning and you have a child and 3 pets and the pets walk around and you have to walk with your child because they're cranky, you do whatever you have to do. I'm here to help you. If you're driving, a lot of my students started calling it Professor Thompson's podcasts, so they would listen and then go back and read the slides. Again, another simple example of meeting the students right where they were at. I recorded classes and then I created a summary of the key things I wanted students to take away. And I continued to reinforce self-determination. How can we use your strengths to complete an assignment or two, depending on what we had available? We talked also about, and I think it's important as we continue to go through this experience, as we're starting to come out a bit in the US, but not in other countries from a global perspective, that shared trauma impacts everyone in a learning community, whether they're Caucasian and privileged or they are not. It takes place in a political context, and this COVID pandemic has certainly taken place in a political context. We had significant and continue to have significant increases in Asian American and Black racism. We have to be reminded of the grossly unequal toll the pandemic had taken on women and members of the BIPOC community. We had to be mindful of students that lost resources or lacked resources, and then finally communities and families that had lost someone to death. So we also had spaces for grief, and we had to be aware of that when we were teaching. And I'm hoping that others will contribute and share what they did as these traumas unfolded. I was part of a learning community where I had 1 hour. I found out that we had lost a student to COVID, and I had 1 hour to prepare what I was going to do with the learning community. And so the things that I talked about building community agreements, talking about norms, being flexible and nimble, served us well during that really trying and traumatic experience. Resilience, demonstrate your own. I had actually talked about things I did well and things I didn't do so well with my own high school student. I celebrated students' successes. We talked about their own successes each week. Some of them were just happy that they, got outside or something like that, but celebrating them continues to build community, makes the community aware of the resilience that each member is showing. And then successes in the learning community. We would talk about things like, you made it to class today, big success, right? We would ask students if they had, I would ask students if they had successes they wanted to share, whether it was student specific or in an assignment. And then we talked about creativity and how we were, as a community, flexible and nimble, which you're probably tired of hearing, but it's totally helped. How did we as a learning community use creativity in our goal to finish the work we were doing and find ourselves feeling resilient? The other thing I did, as you can tell when I talk about finding different assignments for students, is I utilized differentiated instruction to meet the students where they were at when it came to assignments. So when you're looking at differential curriculum and crisis intervention and trauma-informed teaching and learning, it offers differentiated curriculum, offers students choice. Well, while they have to demonstrate that they've successfully mastered the course material, it does give them choice of assignment. It can also meet a student where they're at and allow them to use their strengths. And it also allows you, as the leader of the learning community, to demonstrate your willingness to accompany them from where they are to where you'd like them to go through your course map or experience. So I wanted to provide you a sample. I did this in a class. I teach a social work and military class. And instead, generally the students read a memoir and write a paper and complete a psychosocial assessment. And instead, students had to choose from one of each category. So they had 3 choices. They could complete the biopsychosocial assessment of the main character. They could create an infographic. They could read the memoir. So first, they have to choose one from the first row, one from the second row, and one from the third row. But I also told them that I would be happy to listen to them. Students loved this. They loved the fact that they had a choice. They loved the fact that they could use their own strengths, and it wasn't just a paper or a presentation. So I show you this, you don't have to read it, but we had talked about in this class the recovery framework and the medical model. I teach a mental health class as well, so this is irrelevant from the perspective you don't really need to know what those 2 things mean. But this was supposed to be a 7 to 10 page paper, and it was supposed to be due at the end of the class. And so we, as a learning community, came together to decide what the heck are we going to do with this paper, because no one had the energy to deal with a 7 to 10 page paper. So we created kind of like a family feud thing where we had debates. One team was the recovery framework team and the other team was the medical model team, and we gamed it. So we used gamification inside class. And so long as we could demonstrate that we understood the theory, the course content, and the concepts surrounding the recovery model and the recovery framework and the medical model, we were in, and it worked beautifully. And in fact, I will be using it again this coming spring. So I will tell you, as I look at our time, this was really a transformative experience for me as a faculty member. It is definitely humbling. It's led to a lot of research that I'm doing in the application of equity-informed pedagogy and differentiated instructional approaches. And it allowed me to deeply apply trauma-informed teaching and learning information and training that I had received. So I thank you so much for coming. I'd love to connect with you. You can reach me on Twitter at MMT98, or my email is mthompson@dom.edu. I love to collaborate. So I would love to hear from you.
Right. Well, thanks. No, that's great. And for some reason, we did have you on the schedule for a full hour, so I think we've got plenty of time to talk and wrap it up. So I don't know what to make of that, but we can fill the time or not fill the time. So there's time for questions, I think, is what we're learning, and time to talk about other things. So questions from the audience on this one and other things that people want to talk about. Because yeah, I know you certainly coming at it from your perspective, you're probably particularly well suited to be able to deal with the pandemic and work appropriately with people during these times. Because I think it was just a radical transition for a lot of people. So I guess for you coming,
Mhm.
you're from your social work kind of background, I guess. How different was the type of empathy that you found yourself needing to employ during the pandemic compared to the way you might normally run a class? And that's sort of a strange question, but I'm sort of thinking that your ways of approaching classes are a little bit different from traditional professors anyway because of your background.
When I initially started teaching, I was a pretty rigid professor, and this is a while ago. So follow the syllabus, get the job done, grading it, and so on. And that certainly I evolved in that. But this is probably the first year and a half that I have been this flexible and creative with students. I think to answer your question though, while my training is in social work, which does on paper sound like I'd be really prepared for this, I was not prepared for the amount of grief that impacted my students. And so each week navigating that in a most respectful way while trying to get into what we were trying to get into that week was a challenge. That I will definitely say that it was very challenging to be respectful and humble to people while asking people to still be present for class.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I mean, it's got to be just a difficult line to determine, like when do you ask something of someone and when do you just let them go do what they need to do? And I think that, I mean, better than I do, but there's just not always an easy answer to that, right? Like
No.
sometimes you need to be distracted, right? Sometimes during a time of grief, you need to be distracted in order to just not think about it 24/7 and to try to, I think keep your mind on something else. But then you don't want to put people in a position where you're feeling, you appear to be insensitive and they've gone through something so traumatic and you're asking them to, show up to a class.
That's true. And I had students, colleagues who would email me and say, this happened to, Joe, and we're really worried about Joe. And so I would reach out to Joe and say, listen, if you don't think you can make it to class tonight, remember I'll record it. I will have information available to you, and here's my drop-in hours. And Joe had the response that you talked about, David. I can't, I need to be distracted. I'm coming to class.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and do people always know that they need to be distracted? I guess is kind of the other question. And like, I mean, everyone, no matter how well you know yourself, like just in a time of such a time, I don't know how easy it is to know. So that, probably had to leverage maybe your previous relationship with the students to sort of know what to suggest and what not to suggest, or how much you wanted to, thought you should have any sort of opinion about it. I don't know. It really sounds like so much involved.
There was. It was probably the most labor intensive time that I've taught, but the rewards, I have been a transformed faculty member. The rewards of being creative and being curious with students instead of saying, the assignment has to be done this way. Why aren't we looking at a student's strengths? Well, maybe David's not the best writer, and I need you to be able to share that the information you learned has stuck. And maybe David loves art, right? And I don't know this, and now he's making an infographic with the key information that needs to be present. And then the other pro to that is I'm building a working relationship with David, right? As we're meeting together and talking about, okay, you're being vulnerable and honest. Let's think about what you're hoping to get out of this class and this assignment, and what do I have to make sure you take away from the class.
Yeah. Did you find yourself working more individually with people during this time than normal?
Yes. And so I would work with people initially. They started to try and make an appointment, and I just said, these are the office hours. I'm open. If something's personal, private, or confidential, somebody's going to let me know, and then we're going to have a different meeting. But this is come on in. Jessica has this question, and Rashid has this question. And then students are hearing, this idea of, well, maybe I can try this a little bit differently. And here's resources for support. And I'm not going to lose points if I don't come to class. There's an option for me to write a 2-page reflection if I listen to the recording or meet with the professor and go through the slides. But it was also the most rewarding and most satisfying time to work with people.
Yeah, no, I can imagine it's both. It's just such a, yeah, I mean, when it's, how big were your classes typically?
Up to 25 students.
Okay, so it's a fair number of people to get to know, but not an unmanageable number of people to get to know, I guess, right? Like I
No.
think, I know, I mean, are there things you think, like suppose just for a minute, just to, imagine a different world. Suppose you had a class of 300 students.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things you might be able to take away from what you did with the 25 that could work a little bit on a larger scale? I know you couldn't be as individual with everybody and have enough hours in the week, but are there things that you might have done, a little bit differently?
Yes, I would have certainly hoped that at that point I had 3 to 5 graduate assistants. That would have been great, but a graduate assistant or two where you can convey that this is my teaching philosophy. This is what I believe. Let me know if you're in a situation with a student where they need something creative. Let's talk about it together. Because I would imagine if I'm in a class of 300 students, I have at least one GA. And that would be the position I would be in. I also often provide examples of other assignment students have done to show students that I mean what I say and I say what I mean. So in the situation where someone did an infographic instead of a paper, I will show that so the class knows that that's an option. Yes, it would be a lot more difficult to do some of this with a large class, but I would expect the university to be supportive of faculty when we're working through something like this.
Right. I think so. I know really no other way. And, I know my own experience at, in my class at Teachers College of Columbia was, so some of the university was very much, and the college was very much behind, anything that people could do to make the students' lives easier during this time. And they would support really any direction that you might want to take, and encouraged you to, be, not that I didn't need this one, but, encourage people in general to just to, be very open to what students were comfortable with. And, if they needed to take an incomplete, they took an incomplete. If they needed extra time, they got extra time. And, to just let people work through things in whatever way was best for them. And also other situations were different. I mean, really, some people were in different countries and different experiences. Some people were in different states having different experiences. Some people had, had family members who did have COVID, some who didn't. It was just really all across the board. And, everybody had really different, different fears and different ways of dealing with it.
Same experience, right? That you're sharing that we had to be as flexible and nimble as we possibly could be. And does that sound like a big ask? Yes. But when I'm looking at young people whose parents are in the ICU because of COVID, or they can't go home overseas to their family because of COVID, that's much bigger than what I'm trying to teach you. And so how do I help you prepare, or do we have a decision to make where you're going to hit pause and withdraw?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, that's got to be a concern too, right? Like when are you up against the line? And it always gets back to the thing I was trying to get at a little bit with the idea of, people who needed more time, away versus trying to push them a little bit. If you don't do anything, then people kind of just maybe sort of, stuck in a sense.
Asking for a deadline helped. So if a student said, I can't meet the deadline, then my response isn't, okay, you can have it done by Tuesday, right? My response is, what deadline can you meet?
Right.
Right. And then we're tracking that, and so that deadline, and then I am communicating with that student, hey, hang in there, your deadline's coming up. Do you need any help? How are things going?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's got to be really what you had to do. Was your class typically before the pandemic? Like, how individualized was the class before the pandemic? I guess, relative to after. Did that change? It depends on the structure of the class.
So when you say individualized, are you referring to the assignments that I've been speaking
I
about?
think
Tell me
mostly,
more.
yeah. I think mostly, I think that was what was at the top of my head, and I'm not sure if there are other.
I
ways to
don't think
interpret
it
that
was
also
very
might make sense. Okay.
individualized.
Okay. No,
I don't think so. I had a student about a year and a half before the pandemic that faced a crisis that told me she was good in art. And that's when I said, why don't you take this paper? It's the final paper. She had a loss in her family. And I said, why don't we think about how we can use your art to make this happen? And she did choose to go infographics, which it's not the only thing I do, but it
right.
was a way that she could complete the assignment. I had students interview each other for podcasts, like if they were the podcast host about a topic, they thought that was different and fun. And I have other students that couldn't work in a team any longer. I like the idea of people working in teams. Some students really don't like it, and all of a sudden for me to say, who wants to be doing this in a team? Raise your hand, or send me a message in chat. Who doesn't? Right. So then I might have 4 out of 20 people who are like, there's no way I can do this in a team. Off they go.
No, it's good. Actually, that raises another really interesting point, though. What were there people who really benefited from a team, who then, from a social standpoint, really appreciate, worked in a team and really got a lot out of that, and got a lot of, just felt they needed that support.
Yes, I can tell you that in the last 3 learning cycles, the last 3 semesters, I've had the most positive teacher evaluations I've had in my career. And so this is doing something different. And how are we going to take this kind of learning forward so that we do meet students where they're at? Maybe it's not a collective trauma. Maybe it's not like this, but there's a lot of pandemic healing that has to happen for all of us.
Yeah, there's absolutely no question. There's no question about that. Well, good. Let's say that we may have some more questions. We may not. Let's see, because we're sort of in a funny state, I think, in terms of time for some reason, but we can certainly wrap up if there's nothing else. I don't know why our schedule seemed to not mesh with what your expectation was. So I know, Dan, are there more questions that we have, or do we want to go ahead and wrap up? All right. I think we've had everything that we can have. All right. Well, wonderful. Then I think in that case, let's go ahead and wrap up. And Melissa, it was great to see you both today, and I guess I said yesterday. I think it was actually Monday, wasn't it? The days are blurring together.
Thanks
that
for
not
a wonderful
yesterday?
Conference.
No, thank you so much for being such a big part of it. We absolutely hope to see you at as many sessions as you have time for the rest of the week, and back again and next year, as we discussed off the air in person in New York, and we'll get you here. So
I would love it.
Absolutely looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care. You too. All right. Bye-bye.